All right, well, I used to have an identity, but now I'm just the bishop's brother. So I am Ashley Fernandes. I know I don't look like an Ashley Fernandes. I am not a Hispanic woman, as you can see. But I have several disclosures to make. If you Google me, there are other Ashley Fernandeses out there. I just have to tell you guys this. There's another Ashley Fernandes, also Indian American, also studied at Johns Hopkins. One of us was convicted of murdering our girlfriend, and the other one has a wife who would probably sometimes like to kill him. One of them is nefarious, the other one is fairly harmless. These are the pictures, just so you guys don't get confused. And as you can tell, I'm much better looking than this dude. So I look, I was telling this joke, at various places I speak around the country, and then I realized, what if this guy gets out on parole? Finds out I've been making fun of him, comes and finds me. He's in prison for life, no possibility of parole. So I'm safe, and I can continue to be a nerd who makes this joke everywhere I go. Disclosure number 2, I am not my employer. I do absolutely love this photo, but I am not Ohio State or Nationwide Children's, and I do not speak for them. My views here are my own. Disclosure number 3 is that I have biases. And I'm going to disclose them to you now, at least some of them in no particular order, my top 5 biases. Now, I will remind everybody that everyone has biases. It's so funny, I check off these things like, did you notice any bias? Ohio State has these forms that you check off after you see a talk, and it says commercial bias, philosophical bias. It's like everyone has biases, and I'm going to tell you my top 5 in no particular order. First, I believe in the rational, the irrational, and the non-rational, okay? So the rational are those things that can be demonstrated by logic and logical syllogisms. The irrational are the opposite of those things. I think we have a philosopher somewhere in the front row here. The non-rational are things that are outside of either of those 2 boxes, and I'll explain a little bit more what that means. Second, I do believe in things that are metaphysical, beyond the physical, okay? That there is this body of knowledge that exists outside the empirical of what we can taste and feel and touch and so on, and that there are some things in this world that human beings will never understand. That's important. That's an important bias. So there are some scientists and some physicians who think that everything is explainable, every single thing. And the way in which science progresses, with or without mystery, makes a difference to its moral character. But I'm someone who says there are some things which are both metaphysical and some things which are mysterious, and therefore that suggests that there is a limit to what science and medicine can and maybe should do. I believe in God. Maybe not all of you do in this room, and that's okay. So sometimes, you watch crazy people and you just say, I can get a little nugget of truth out of this crazy person. That's what I want you to do if you don't believe in God. I do believe in God, but I also respect the science, not the other way around. I believe in objective truth, and that's part of the reason that this talk even exists. And the objective truth that I believe in is something that is penetrable to everyone in this room. It's something that actually draws us in, almost like a magnet draws you in. There are things which we feel when we have grasped that truth, that it sits right with us. That's truth's ability to draw us in. But how do we attain that? We attain that, I think, in at least 2 sources. One is through reason. Someone presents us with a problem. Take mathematics. We can be presented with a problem, we can solve that problem, and suddenly we realize that there is a truth here to this problem. But there's also the truth that can be drawn from experience. Now, as I'm going to show, this is not everybody has their own truth, but rather there are things which happen to us from which, when we reflect on, we are drawn into that same truth that can be discernible by reason. So this is not something that the only thing you have to do is reason things out. It's important to take into account people's emotions, people's feelings, but to be able to realize that that also has the power. In philosophy, we call this entire discipline phenomenology, the ability to reflect on experience, to extract truths from the world. Lastly, I believe in the dignity and value of all people. I'm going to talk about controversial things as I am a bioethicist. I'm going to talk about abortion. I'm going to talk about stem cell research briefly. I'm going to talk about transgender science briefly. The fact that I talk about it does not mean that I disrespect anybody or that I think anybody's worth less than anybody else. So because I believe in the dignity and value of all persons, what people do, don't do, haven't done yet, are going to do is irrelevant to their dignity and value. I'm going to pause here for a second. I just have to say this. I want to thank the president of this university, President Gallagher. I want to thank the sisters for inviting me here. I want to thank Father and all the faculty members here and you students for being here. This is an incredible university. Now, you heard my bio. I've been educated at a number of different universities. Your presence here is a gift, and this university is a gift to you. I have to say this because Father Dan was explaining to me sort of your 4-year thematic course where you concentrate on the human person in 1 year, and then the common good, and then justice, and then finally in truth, which is where we are today. But that is absolutely revolutionary. That has nothing to do, although it's a way of drawing in that Catholic identity in which the sisters founded this university. If only every university was able to focus on those 4 truths. So I just want to say, I mean, you guys may not realize you come here day after day, but I have never been to a university anywhere that has those 4 themes in that order. And it is just so beautiful. So really reflect on your education here. This is an absolute gift. And I wish more universities would do what you guys are doing here. Disclosure 4, I'm not crazy. I've said all of that, and despite all my disclosure biases, if I can get you to this idea that I'm not crazy, then that's sort of a small victory for me. So that's my 4th disclosure. I'm really not. All right, let's talk about the scientific method. A couple of my med students are here. I could ask them, or I could ask many of the scientific faculty or students that are here, what is the scientific method in a nutshell? And I know the people in the back really can't see this very well, so I'll walk us through it. If you remember, the scientific method is first an observation in nature. Okay, everybody does this. We observe the things around us. We have an observation in nature. We then develop hypotheses about that observation. And then we test those hypotheses through experimentation with the notion of trying to falsify those hypotheses. Really you're not supposed to try to demonstrate them, you try to falsify them. When you can't falsify them, then you invent more experiments, they become a theory and so on, and then we act on it. This is a tool that we use every single day, both inside and outside of medicine and in any of the natural sciences. This, believe it or not, is what St. Albert the Great pioneered. People who were scientists prior to St. Albert the Great had no concept of empirical experimentation. They believed in myths. Let's look at some of you cannot read this, but let's look at this statement. We can safely, for the mother at least, perform an abortion. Now that's a true statement. That is a true statement. That tells us what science is, okay, and it's based on the scientific method. But nowhere does that same method that I've just outlined answer this question: abortion is morally good. Is that true or not? That is not a scientific question. We can see the scientific statement that precedes it, but to answer whether or not abortion is morally good from a moral point of view, takes something outside the scientific method itself. The COVID vaccine is safe and effective. That is a scientific statement. Yes, we can show that empirically that it is safe and effective. But how about this statement? COVID vaccines should be mandatory. Now, that is not something you can test through experimentation, try to falsify, and develop a theory. That it should be mandatory is a moral or ethical statement. Therefore, it requires an entirely different structure in order to evaluate that statement. Now, let that sink in for a second. Let's just take the COVID example. If someone says, believe the science about the COVID vaccine, It's a moral statement they're trying to make, not a scientific statement. You can't believe the science because the scientific method itself is inadequate to address the question of whether or not COVID vaccines should be mandatory. This is from a familiar place. This is a quotation from your own campus. And I want to highlight, it's from St. Albert the Great, science does not consist simply in believing what we are told, but in inquiring into the nature of things. If only the Ohio State University had this on their campus, but they don't. This is how blessed you guys are to be here. You can walk past this every day to remind you science does not consist simply in believing what we are told. Now think of what a remarkable statement this is for a 13th century Dominican. You don't just believe what you're told. And I hope you all think that way as well. Now, why does this matter? Let's look at this case study. This is ripped from the headlines. We all know what crisis pregnancy centers are. They are centers around this state and around many places in the country that help women who are abortion-minded decide to keep their baby. They will do ultrasounds. They do pregnancy testing. They do STI testing. They also provide baby clothes, parenting classes after the baby is born, scholarships for new moms to go to college or the school of their choice. But now they are being labeled as medical misinformation because they do ultrasounds to show expectant mothers that this is a human being, that there's a beating heart there. That's why truth matters. That's why you can't conflate scientific truths or scientific statements with moral statements. I'm from Northwest Ohio. This is from Bowling Green, Crisis Pregnancy Center in Bowling Green. I want to show you what the result of this is, of the sort of the corruption of what truth is in the sciences. You can see this, and I want to look at this. I don't know if you can see that red circle. The people that vandalize this Crisis Pregnancy Center are kind of showing themselves and what they believe. Oh, this slide is all messed up. But I'm going to, I don't know how that happened. But I'm going to try to talk you through why St. Albert the Great, what his legacy is, and why this matters. First, which you cannot see, he was someone who was prayerful. He was someone who was prayerful. He would not be a saint if he was not that. And so for those of you who do believe, there is no contradiction between being a faithful person and being a scientist or a physician or whatever you want to be. Second, he strove for excellence. He strove for excellence in all that he did, and he advanced the field. Now that's a really important thing. You are not here and you are not getting a degree so that you can be so that you can be blah, so that you can get a paycheck. The legacy of Albert the Great teaches us that we need to strive for excellence in everything that we do. That's a really, really important thing. You want people to know, without asking, that you came from Ohio Dominican University. And ultimately, you want to advance your field. That should be your goal if you're going to a place like this. Third, he courageously engaged the outside world. Now, what I mean by this is, Albert the Great was probably the first person to catalog all of Aristotle's works, which was a remarkable thing, and then to engage with Aristotle, who was a pagan, to really try to figure out what did he mean by this. And these thoughts, for example, Aristotle believed that there was no beginning or ending to the world, which is a direct challenge to the Christianity which St. Albert the Great believed in. So now I have a direct challenge from this brilliant philosopher. How do I engage with that person without just saying, well, the Bible tells me, and push it away? He actually went out to engage them. There were Muslim thinkers, brilliant Muslim thinkers, Avicenna, Averroes, they're called in the West. These Muslim thinkers posed direct challenges to Christian philosophy, and Albert the Great chose to go out and engage with people who thought differently from him. Fourth, he taught with excellence. Father Dan mentioned his most famous teacher was St. Thomas Aquinas, a doctor of the church, and he left by teaching a legacy of excellence. And obviously your faculty here are doing the same thing, and I hope that the students here, I hope you plan to do the same thing as well. He served with humility. Whatever he did, he served with humility. After he became bishop, he refused to ride a horse. I know that sounds like not a big deal, but think this is the 1200s, okay? Roads were not good. He refused to ride a horse, which all bishops did, and instead he walked on foot. I want you to think about the legacy of St. Albert the Great as we go through these, and we're going to look at this idea of truth and the problems that we're having in medicine and science through three different lenses today. The first is philosophical, the second is professional, and the third is on the individual level. There are upstream and downstream effects from what we're seeing with respect to truth in each of these areas. So let's look at the philosophical. This is where culture and science collide. They both impact one another, but they both point to a deeper philosophical issue, which is at stake. We live in a secularist culture, a growing secularism, and really secularist, where a sort of theological presence is not welcome. Okay, it's considered crazy, it's considered an extra, an add-on. So St. Albert the Great's society is gone. And we have to live with an increasingly secularist culture. This is St. Anthony the Great, a great saint of the East and West, who said, "A time is coming when men will go mad, and they will see someone who is not mad, and they will attack him, saying, 'You are mad because you are not like us.'" And that time is here. First, society is becoming increasingly not just secular, but atheist. 1/3 of the generation of students that are in this room, 1/3 say they never pray or have never prayed. That's a big difference from my generation, which is Generation X, just a few decades ago, which that number was something like 80% do pray. So that number is falling, and that's important because what it shows is a lack of belief in something outside oneself, and I'll talk about that later. This is a photo from recently here in Ohio, November 7th, 2023. This is a group of people that were celebrating the Issue 1 passage. So they're celebrating abortion rights. I just want to point out there was a child there who was smiling, and this was, to me, this as a pediatrician is a little disturbing, but there we are. This is a headline from the Washington Post from 2017 on the left. "When doctors refuse to see transgender patients, the consequences can be dire." And on the right, this is our newest Supreme Court justice saying she cannot define what a woman is. But I want you to see the headline here, which says, "When doctors refuse to see transgender patients." If you actually read the article, it talks about doctors who have moral objections to transgender hormones, but they don't refuse to see the patient. They don't refuse to care for the patient. And so there's a difference here, and people probably should have read the article. It's interesting that Justice Ketanji Brown says, Jackson says, "I'm not a biologist." And I think that's an interesting statement because what it suggests, in a strange kind of twist, is that she thinks that is the scientist and the scientist alone who can determine whether or not, or what the definition of a woman is, which I think is interesting. No philosophy need be involved. Assisted suicide and euthanasia. You are not allowed to call assisted suicide a suicide anymore. I don't know if you guys know that. If I wanted to get an article published on assisted suicide, whether I was for it or against it, I'm not allowed to call it assisted suicide. I have to call it medical aid in dying. The acronym is MAID. Otherwise, they won't publish it. I mean, isn't that interesting? Because maids are so helpful. You know, they help clean up messes. So you have to call it MAID. All of this revolves around this fundamental philosophical question. What is the nature of the human person? That is at the core of this idea of truth on this macro level or this philosophical level. When we say assisted suicide should be allowed because the person is suffering, and someone else says, Well, doctors shouldn't help a person commit suicide when they're suffering interminably. Both of those statements are using the word person, but they mean two entirely different things. And that's the core. Let's look at one model of person. One model of person is what I call the materialist model. Okay? The materialist model suggests that what a human person is a random collection of atoms that is here by accident, and when you die, you become worm food. Okay, that's it. Nothing happens to you after that. Now, think about this for a second. This is the predominant philosophy of the person that you see in medical education and in most science classes that are taught today. But think about that for a second. It could be true. Maybe it is. But if it's true, then let's take this concept of suffering. If that's true, then the only thing that matters about suffering is that you can tolerate it or you can't tolerate it. Okay? The only thing that matters about you are your choices. And if someone were to say to you, you can't do that, that's a violation not just of your choice, but ultimately of your dignity. Something like religion itself, which believes in the transcendent idea of human beings, religion becomes something not essential to the human person. It's a funny hat that you can take on and off. This is what happens when you Google funny hat. You get this picture, which I thought was good. But religion, you see, is just a funny hat you can take on and off. In medical school, that's what we are taught is, oh, you can be a religious person, but you have to take your, they don't say hat, you have to take your white coat off. When you put on your white coat, you take your religious hat off. Okay, that's what we're told. So you see, it's dispensable. Religion becomes this funny hat that you put on and off. Choice becomes the central unit of value. When someone blocks your choice, they have violated your dignity. Now, this may sound very appealing, except that it misses out on a lot of what it means to be a human being, and it leads to ideas like this. This is Steven Pinker, who's a very smart guy. He's a professor of linguistics at MIT. And he says, for example, this concept of dignity, human dignity, which almost everybody in this room believes in and believes should be universal, that is a stupid idea. Dignity, he says, is just autonomy. If you feel dignified, if you think this person has dignity, and that's your choice, but if you don't, then it doesn't matter. We're all worm food after all. Now, what this leads to then is this idea that if all we are atoms, if all we are biology, then you have to believe whatever biology says is therefore good if you think it's good. And this leads to what I call a dogmatic materialism. That is, it asks you to believe something philosophically, like a religious sect would ask you to believe, without any reason, rational thought, or opposition. And that leads to a dogmatic scientism. Okay? St. Thomas Aquinas said, nothing is in the intellect that was not first in the senses. But when we hear this phrase, believe the science, I want you to look very suspiciously at that phrase, because that is not science. You do not believe in the science like you believe in a God. Dogma is the province of religion. Science is a discipline by nature of skepticism. And once we start integrating this idea of believe the science into who we are as physicians, scientists, and healthcare practitioners, it becomes very problematic. You can see that notion of dogmatic scientism has been used over and over like a bludgeon, particularly recently. This is G.K. Chesterton, and he said, there are two kinds of people in the world, the conscious dogmatists and the unconscious dogmatists. I have always found myself that the unconscious dogmatists were by far the most dogmatic. They are the people that stand with credibility, with science degrees, and will tell you, you must believe this, without any moral analysis of what they're telling you you must believe. In philosophy, we call this the mistaken idea of what is with what ought to be. I can tell someone that polygamy is practiced around the world. That is a social science fact. But I cannot tell you, using science or the social sciences, that polygamy ought to be practiced, or cannibalism, or any kind of moral action, simply because there are people that do it. The implications of the materialist view of the person is that science and religion are always fighting. This cartoon says, meanwhile, Jesus and Darwin were fighting again. Looks like Jesus might be winning. That could be my bias. There, that's number 6. But this translates into documents within my own profession. So this is the American Academy of Pediatrics in 2009, and they say, so they're talking in this context about physicians who refuse to perform abortions or refer for abortions, etc. And they say this: physicians generally can refuse to perform actions they consider medically inappropriate. Conscientious objections are typically not based on medical knowledge, but on moral, religious, or political beliefs. The ability to refuse to provide a service or treatment on these or other bases is not part of being a physician. So as early as 2009, the professional body that I belong to and that I was on their bioethics committee recently, this is what they say: you shouldn't be a physician if you don't believe that. Here's another guy, Professor Julian Silviescu, in 2006, Oxford University, again, not a dumb guy. He says, if people are not prepared to offer legally permitted, efficient, and beneficial care to a patient because it conflicts with their values, they should not be doctors. Pretty straightforward. Now, what I want to point out about this statement, which you could just read and pass over, is that the very things which people who morally object to certain practices within medicine are that it is beneficial care. Okay, this is passed over. This is glossed over. If medicine can do it, then to not do it is somehow a moral fault, according to Professor Silviescu. I'd also like to point out that, in my opinion, love is not very efficient. It's an inefficient thing. And if you love another person, especially a vulnerable person, efficiency is not the thing which you should be striving for, particularly in medicine. Let's look at a case study here about a philosophy of materialism that went amok. As many of you are aware, physicians, nurses, and other healthcare practitioners actively participated in the Nazi atrocities preceding World War II and then into World War II. They were critical to the development of concentration camps, to the efficient killing of people that were felt undesirable, and they participated actively in things like medical experimentation, on euthanasia for disabled children, on euthanasia for gay people, on euthanasia for gypsies and other people that they deemed unworthy of life. What happened here? What happened here was that the entire idea of the human person was thought to be related to material. You are nothing except what the state says you are. The good of the individual person was eclipsed by the good of the race, in this case, the Aryan race. And all healthcare practitioners were taught this. You would be a student and you would be sitting there in class, and your professor would teach you that there was nothing transcendent about the human person, this individual person. There was only something transcendent about this race. Now think about that for a second. The value of the individual person is sacrificed for some other good. And that is a dangerous place to be when you have the power of medicine at your fingertips. The philosophy of medicine, what you think about the human person who medicine acts on, is critically important to how medicine operates. This is a photograph of some images from a Nazi film, propaganda film, where they were trying to show how worthless disabled people were. So they took a person, an intellectually disabled person, and this shows you how the Nazis altered the lighting from one frame to the next to try to find the worst lighting for this person. You know, like when you take a photo and you're like, oh, that's bad lighting, I look horrible. Well, they did this to these poor people in order to make them look like monsters, and then the editor would say, we'll put that one in the film. Okay? And there's documentation of this. The depersonalization of another person so that their value was obscured by what you're seeing. This is how doctors participated in these Nazi propaganda films. But there is an alternative. Now, even if you're not a Christian, and even if you don't believe in the transcendent, listen and see if this seems reasonable to you, or at least a reasonable alternative to the materialist philosophy that I've just outlined. This idea of personalism is that, and this is a beautiful quote from John Paul II, St. Pope John Paul II, who says, he's talking about reason and science, or faith and philosophy. And he says, faith and philosophy are not two entirely separate things. They form, he said, wherever there's a border, which we can conceptualize a border between faith and reason, that's also a place where two things meet, like a reef. Think about a reef in the ocean. And there's a beautiful exchange. If you've ever seen a reef or things breaking on the ocean, there's this beautiful exchange between this border. And that's how we should think about faith and philosophy. The two can actually inform one another. Now, John Paul II puts forward this idea of the person that we can think of as an alternative to the materialist view. He says a person is four things. A person is the kind of thing that thinks and can reason. Okay, that makes sense. We do that every single day. But there's more. We are not just rational animals. There's more to this. A human person is the kind of thing that loves. Human beings are the only beings that can love and give of one another selflessly apart from God. Third, a human being is the kind of thing that acts morally. And this is the key to human existence. This is what makes us really different, is that we can actually look at something and say, I could do this, but I won't. Choosing is not just making choices. Choosing doesn't give us freedom. Freedom lies in choosing the good. Okay? Freedom lies in choosing the good. When you choose something that's truly and actually and objectively good, you understand yourself as the author of that action, and you know you have grasped something that is true. And that changes your character. Fourth, and this is really important when you think about what you're learning here at this university, solidarity. This idea that the person next to me, my neighbor, is also a part of me. Martin Luther King Jr. was also a personalist. And he has this beautiful quote where he says, I can never be who I ought to be until you are who you ought to be. And you can never be who you ought to be until I am what I ought to be. This is the interrelated structure of reality. So we cannot just be these people that make choices all by ourselves. We cannot demand that nobody interferes with us when we make our choices. We are related to one another, and we have to see it through for the vulnerable patient, for the vulnerable person, for the person that's making a bad decision. Now, contrast these two views. One says that if I interfere with you, I'm infringing on your dignity, and the other one says, I love you, I believe that you and I are related in our common destiny, and I will do everything I can to see that your dignity is elevated. This is why when you translate this into the physician-patient relationship, you have two people bound by a covenant, not a contract. Two people, and for all of you that are in the health sciences here, two people are bound not by a contract. You don't just do what the patient asks you. You are a person, they are a person. You're both committed to each other's good. So there's a covenant of mutual obligations and trust. On this view, the acting person becomes the singular or central unit of value. Not pleasure, not reason, not choice. It is the person herself that demands of us to raise her dignity to the highest level possible. All right. Let me just pause for a second. I know this young lady up here in the front gets this. All right, second, professional values. Who decides what medicine is? How is truth related to our professional values? You will all see this phrase repeated over and over again called standard of care. You must follow the medical standard of care. Now this has become very controversial because it has allowed professional bodies to push for unethical things and demand that we all do that without any moral analysis. And that is a problem. We're not like lemmings that just follow each other off a cliff. The standard of care itself must be analyzed. Otherwise, we risk falling into scientific, medical, or professional dogmatism. Again, I've already talked about this believe, trust, or follow the science. Dogmatic expression, it really has no place in medicine. And there's a weak and strong version of this scientific dogmatism. The weak version says facts are not meaningless. Science is a tool that can help clarify a certain process, and I think most of us are very sympathetic with that view. But the strong version is a policy option that says policy options can be firmly determined by science alone. It piggybacks on people's acceptance of the power of science, or of the weak version of this, of scientific dogmatism, and uses it as a rhetorical device. Do not be fooled by this. Science informs. It is a tool. But humans are the ones that assign moral value to things. So, in this case, the patient's own welfare might be eclipsed by some other good, which is the good of following the science. And the consequences of this is that people just don't buy it, right? Unfortunately for us, unfortunately for me as a pediatrician, after the mess that happened with COVID, we have had really a loss of trust, which we're seeing now in the clinics. This is just an example. COVID-19 pandemic fuels the largest continued backslide in vaccinations in 3 decades. I'm a pediatrician. I totally believe in vaccines, okay? And I try to talk to families about them. But they have lost so much trust in our profession now that they will not do it. Even things like they used to get immunized for, they will not do anymore. Now, I want to just talk about this since it's in the news recently about the science of abortion and how, on this professional level, we have problems with this. I don't know if you all can see that. This is an example of a fetal surgeon. You can see that little hand grasping the surgeon's finger. What are we to make of this? St. Thomas Aquinas tells us that everything that is true is first discovered in the senses, right? What are we to make of this? I just want you to think about that. Like, what is this thing that is coming out of a uterus and grasping a surgeon's finger? Pre-viable fetus, by the way. For those of you that want to Google something in all your spare time, Google this, Your Destiny from Day One. This is Nature, the journal Nature, which is the most prestigious scientific journal in the world, in 2002. This is 21 years old. This short article, which is 2 pages, talks about how from conception, the unborn being is not a mindless blob, but actually has its own destiny. It's very fascinating. Nothing has changed about the science in 21 years. Fetal heartbeat. 6 weeks it can be heard, but you are not allowed to say heartbeat anymore. I don't know if you guys have noticed this. Read the latest AP post, Reuters, in any journalistic publication, in any scientific publication, you cannot say heartbeat. It's too emotive. You actually have to say fetal cardiac activity. This is a photo. Is this a blob of tissue? Is this my choice? What are we to make of this? And finally, I just want to talk about the effect of abortion on women who have had it. There have been a number of studies. Professor Priscilla Coleman has published 2 very, very strong systematic reviews of the effect of abortion on women afterwards that show a very, very high increase in mental health problems after an abortion, in abortion regret syndrome, etc. I tell you this story only because, you can look that up, but only because there's been an effort now, since Roe versus Wade was overturned, to have her 2 papers retracted. Okay? Scientists got together, they wrote letters to the editor of these journals and said, without any scientific information, but that it was an affront to reproductive justice and that those papers should be retracted. Now, is that science? That is not science. To retract a paper without any scientific evidence to the contrary, but to say it doesn't fit with our philosophy is dogma. And it's something that we thought we had cast off. How about viability as a standard for personhood and human rights? This is this baby, who's now 4 years old and counting. Her name is Lila. She was 4 years old in 2018, so she's 9 now. She was born at 21 weeks, 4 days old. Clearly before the limit of viability. She has 0 neurological problems. And if this can be done with one child 1 week earlier at 20 weeks is what we call pain capable. Is that a blob of tissue? Is that something that we shouldn't pay attention to? So science is a tool that can say, hey, the limit of viability is kind of wobbly. It doesn't tell us what we ought to do about the limit of viability, or whether Lila has any purpose in this world, or whether, had her mother made another choice, she might not even exist. So trusting the science is the most anti-science statement ever. As Linus says, questioning science is how you do science. Lastly, I want to talk about our personal views here. Is perception reality? Okay, we hear that phrase, perception is reality. But that's not true. That's an idiom. That doesn't actually tell us what the truth is. But we do need to know about what relativism is. So you guys have probably learned this before, but cognitive relativism is this idea that there is no such thing as truth. Have you ever heard anybody say that? There's no such thing as truth. Now, I'm going to dispatch with this idea in about 2 seconds. We don't need to spend much time on it because it's ridiculous. A person that says there's no such thing as truth, that statement, there's no such thing as truth, is either true or false. If it's true that there's no such thing as truth, then it makes the statement false because there's at least one thing, which is the proposition that there's no such thing as truth. If it's false that there's no such thing as truth, well, then that argument also stands. So basically, in philosophy, we call this a self-referentially incoherent statement, and we're done with cognitive relativism. Cultural relativism, however, is much more prevalent, and this is the idea that because people do things, that means we ought to permit them to do those things. And you can see there's a distinction there. Okay, this is fundamentally seen sometimes in this idea of tolerance. But it confuses anthropology or sociology, the things of the social sciences, this is what is, with what things ought to be. And those are two different questions. We can say that there is polygamy, cannibalism, whatever you want, but we can't say whether we ought to do that. We can say that we can alter the genetic construction of a child before they're even born to prevent them from having a disease, which seems like a good thing, but we can't say whether we ought to do it without further analysis. The most dangerous form of relativism is this, though, subjectivism. And this is Dr. Phil. I do not watch Dr. Phil, but I know he's kind of famous. He says there is no reality, only perception. And that's an interesting philosophical idea, isn't it? And then when you look on Google Images, you get these different versions of this. Perception is not reality. Perception is real even when it's not reality. Your perception is not my reality. So which of the following is true, or is it all of the above? In short, the truth ends up being my choices, right? Your truth, my truth, Oprah's truth, or the truth as one of many choices. And this leads to another problem, a deep problem, which I call experiential nihilism. It's a type of subjectivism that suggests that if I haven't lived exactly how you live, I cannot understand you at all. Okay, and that is actually a dangerous thing to think about, right? If I haven't lived exactly like you, we have no connection to one another. None. So what happens then is in medical ethics, autonomy becomes either infallible, that is, I choose a certain path, and I'm always right. I'm always right. You can never say anything that tells me that I'm wrong. Or autonomy is unassailable. That is to say, you can think I'm wrong, but all we can do is shrug our shoulders and move on. Go ahead and make that mistake. What can I do? You made a choice. But if medicine actually operated on those principles, with autonomy being either infallible or unassailable, we'd be in big trouble. The good of the human person is what medicine is after. And the good of the human person involves not just these top two things that you see on the screen, the person's own conception of the good, or the biological or physiological good of the person. There's also these other two things, which we never talk about. The person's good as a human person, in their bio, psycho, social, and spiritual self, and also the person's spiritual good. I put this triangle down upside down on purpose, because in medical education today, the only thing you learn about are those top two things. Now think about that for a second. If what the physician is supposed to do, or any healthcare provider is supposed to do, is just focus on what the person wants and their biological good, which version of the human person are we throwing all our weight behind? We've forgotten about these last two things, which are so critically important to what medicine is. And you can see this in the changing scientific landscapes around two hot-button issues. Okay? One is embryonic stem cell research. When I was first getting into medical ethics, I can't believe this was 25 years ago, everybody talked about embryonic stem cell research, that it was a moral imperative and that we had to do it. Have you heard anything about that lately? This article published from MIT just a couple of weeks ago says, sort of, where's the beef? Where's the hype? What happened to it? Nothing significant has come out of using embryonic stem cells. The other thing that I know you cannot see is talking about some of the transgender science and the changing landscape around transgender science. Here we see a couple of articles that medical schools are being taught that biological sex is a social construct. One of them talks about affirming care for autism and gender diversity, and that was published in the journal Pediatrics, which is my profession's journal, in 2023. The other two on the left say questions remain over the use of puberty blockers. That is also published from an AAP news article in 2023. And the other one is from the British Medical Journal that says, this is from 2022, that says gender dysphoria in young people is rising, and so is professional disagreement. So it's interesting, those things which science pushed on us, or is pushing on us, at the same time are being questioned by people, and it's being now reported widely. This is from a Reuters special report, Why Detransitioners Are Crucial to the Science of Gender Care. To be able to follow this where it leads, this is from, again, this is on your campus, a plaque, Truth is the basis of human freedom and the source of human effectiveness. Truth is the basis of human freedom. This is something we do not really grasp, do we? This idea that to follow the truth is not the thing that binds. Truth is the thing that frees. It is the source of human effectiveness. You cannot be who you were called to be unless you relentlessly follow the truth. And so now, in conclusion, I'm just going to go through briefly the truth and legacy of St. Albert the Great. We went through those 5 things at the beginning. Let's talk about what we can do together to follow that legacy of St. Albert the Great. First, we have to be steadfast in faith, in hope, and in charity like he was. He was a saint, and that's how you become a saint. If you don't pray, start. If you pray, pray deeper. That's for starters. But also in charity, we have to love these vulnerable patients. And sometimes it's said that all we care about, like this is a cute little baby with Down syndrome and a little unborn child there, that this is all we care about. But to be true to this, we have to love every vulnerable person and every patient the same. How about this teenager who's depressed or anxious? How about this homeless or disabled person who is on the street? How about the mother that's holding up a sign with her crying baby asking for help on the street? Are we willing to be steadfast in faith and hope and love for these people? How about the people that have a different worldview than us, who we may disagree with, but we are called to help them just the same and to uphold their dignity? Second, Albert strived for intellectual excellence. And that is true. We all are called to do this. To save science and to save medicine, we must be excellent. But we also have to understand science's limits. Even Albert Einstein, who was one of the greatest scientists of all time, said, and funny, he was also named Albert, said this: we should take care not to make the intellect our God. It has, of course, powerful muscles, but no personality. And what he meant by that was you're missing something if all you focus on is the science. There's something great about human life that we are overlooking and would be to our detriment to overlook. Albert the Great also advanced the field. So we have to do the same. We have to look at medical standards of care with an ethical eye and say, I know you're saying that this is possible, but is it morally acceptable to do the same thing? We have to really, really reach in. When your professors are telling you, look at this study, actually look at the study. Okay, actually look at it. See if it's a good study and learn those tools, because we need a new generation of scientists and scholars who can read and critically appraise ideological studies. And always seek the truth even if it is uncomfortable. Even if it challenges your core belief, you must do it. That is what Albert the Great did. This is a picture of my son, by the way, when he was about 15 months old. I'm a little embarrassed because they show this picture because as an Indian American, like 15 months is way too late to get a doctor's kit for him. We should have been doing this like 7 months earlier. So I'm a little ambivalent about showing this photo. Third, we need to courageously engage the outside world, okay? This is not a time, if you are Christian or Catholic, to go into your little Catholic or Christian bubble. It is extremely important that people, all people, whether you're Catholic or not, whether you're Christian or not, that you depart from this university with the belief that you can engage the outside world and not live in a bubble, because that world needs you. This slogan, plus ultra, in Latin, this was the slogan of King Philip V in the age of exploration of Spain. And this idea was to go beyond the horizon. Okay, when the world didn't know what lay beyond the horizon, this was a bold slogan that said, I'm not just going to look at what's in front of me and solve my little problems. I'm going to go beyond that and go beyond the horizon. And we have to be able to do the same, even and maybe especially when it makes you uncomfortable. Fourth, what did St. Albert do? He taught and created a legacy of excellence. And for all the professors and faculty members here, you are doing that. You need to continue to do that. When my students asked me when I left Dayton to come to Columbus, they said, Dr. Fernandes, tell us one bit of wisdom you can throw our way before you leave. And I thought about it for a little while, and this is what I told them. Between good and evil, there is no safe place to stand. There's no neutral space where you're going to be left alone. If you believe you are a light, and if you believe that what you carry is the truth, you must go forward. You cannot retreat, because wherever the light retreats, the darkness invades. Think about that. This world is not about being safe. It's not about being safe. It is about spreading that light of truth into the areas where it is dark. And finally, what is that further beyond? Who are we doing this for? Are you doing it for fame? Are you doing it for yourselves? Are you doing it for monetary value? No, you are going further beyond, especially in healthcare, for them, for these people, for the people that are the most vulnerable. Why? Because if you are religious like me, if you are a scientist and happen to be Christian, you see that in this person in front of you, the visible image of the invisible God. You see that this person in front of you has value no matter what the world has done to them or will do to them or the choices that they make. That is a really, really important truth to grasp. And it humbles you. You are not any better than this person that you serve in front of you. In fact, you take the position that they are of more value than you, and that is why you sacrifice for them. This is a quote from St. Augustine, which I will leave you all with. The truth is like a lion. You don't have to defend it. Let it loose, and it will defend itself. And that is all I have to say. Thank you. And I apologize.